Welcome everyone to Grounds for Sculpture. My name is Julio Bedell. I'm the Director of Education and Community Engagement here at Grounds, and thank you for coming tonight. I know what this thought. Thank you again for coming. This is our last program of the year. It's been a roller coaster of a year, so welcome. We're delighted to welcome it on a high note. Tea, much tea, cookies.
Even the gallery wants to taste the tea.
Yes, yes. So thank you for coming. This is Cultural Conversations. This program is sponsored by Jersey Council for the Arts. And today we have Omar Offendum and José De Leon González in conversation. This program was developed to have artists outside of Grounds for Sculpture's realm interpret works and the current exhibitions of Roberto Lugo and Fragile Earth, and also to give TCNJ students professional development in leading public conversations, the whole research process. There have been many, many hours starting in June of research, conversations back and forth. This is not a one-stop event. This is a lot of work behind that Jose and let me introduce Donia and Leanne have worked on. So the drivers, I've been just the support, admin assistant in this project, but the drivers for this program have been Dunya Salem Harur, sorry, she is a disabled Egyptian American, the executive director of Outlet Dance, an artist, writer, dancer, and herbalism apprentice. She was the inaugural performing artist in residence at Grounds for Sculpture. Dr. Leanne Francis, sharing a chair with her, is the associate professor at TCNJ in two departments, the Department of African American Studies and Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. She has degrees in a PhD in United States and African American history, a master's in US and world history, and a BFA in painting and illustration. And they have been working really all throughout the year with students, coming on site. They're going to talk more about the process. They have been really the wisdom givers to the students and the artists in this project. I'll let Dunya introduce the program.
Actually, tonight Leanne is going to be sharing about the program a little bit.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to stand up. All right. So we spent 5 months intensively engaged in an exploration of a variety of artworks, and then two in particular. The students are handpicked, selected by me. They're very, very special people. Jose is, and Jose included. We're looking at examining the work of BIPOC artists of color. And from an intersectional perspective, these are students in African American studies, women's gender and sexuality studies at the College of New Jersey that are bringing their own expertise. They're not necessarily artists. They're bringing their own expertise in psychology, chemistry, in this case. And it was, I don't have much more to say than that. Would you add anything? You would? Okay.
I would just say that the project is a process of co-learning, of a deep exploration into these particular works, but also seeing what kind of seeds come from spending time with works. And then just, as Dr. Francis had said, considering the ways that thematics intersect, what the repercussions are, what the intentions of the artists are, how that impacts us. So we've also been interested in a kind of embodied research. So not just an elevation only of the academic, but also the student scholars and we have been co-learning through creative practice, through reflection, through movement, through working with clay. And this particular iteration, we did a different iteration last year, but this particular iteration is connected to two exhibits this year. One is Roberto Lugo's The Village Potter, and the other is an exhibit called Fragile Earth by a group called the Color Network. So these are all works of ceramicists of color. So that's what I was saying.
That was great. That was really good. Obviously, we all need each other. But I was going to end. Can I just?
Please, of course.
All right. So I was going to end by saying that it is a sheer pleasure to work with your son, with José De Leon González, and I'll tell you a little bit about him. He is a senior at College of New Jersey, majoring in chemistry with a specialization in biochemistry. Do you want to know what Jose does in his spare time? I know you want to know. Let me get it right. He works to create conductive polymer nanofibers for detecting the release of nitric oxide from cells. That's what he did. He's a genius. He's a genius. And in fact, there are 3 geniuses sitting up here. I know this, and you're going to know this. Omar, I just have to say, rapper, well, a lyricist. I see you as a poet, playwright, and I see you also as a historian. Peace activist, Jose, chemistry, biochemistry, all that other cool stuff that I don't really understand, but it's obviously very impressive. And Dunya, poet, choreographer, dancer, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of things. Extraordinary people, and I'm really happy that you're here tonight. This conversation, so I'm good.
So we are here, and here we are, kind of our semicircle. Come closer if you feel like it. I'm looking particularly at my child. loving him. But welcoming him, however, dancing in this space. I'm just kidding, whatever you want. So one of the things that has been happening is that we're actually in multiple circles. So here is one circle, but we've been walking in multiple circles, right? We all bring our own selves, right? The archives of our own bodies, the archives of who we spend time with, our people, our families. We also want to especially acknowledge the archive, not just the archive, but the sacred land that we are standing on. We are on the land of the Lenape people. This is Lenape Kopi. So we've also been delving into that, the history of place. And we've also been working with the work of these visual artists. So Jose is going to be sharing about, they very much have been comrades in this conversation over the stretch of months. So Jose is going to be sharing about the work of the artists that we have and the artists themselves that we've been focusing on.
Should we just start with this one?
Right, as you're inspired.
So,
It's okay, for the rest of it.
so the sculpture that was there was Babel. It's by, make sure it was by Magdalene Dykstra. I almost got that wrong. So it's to describe it, it's a wooden tower. It's imagine like a mountain kind of, but not really. And then there's a wooden. It's made out of a wooden frame, and it's about, I'd say about, not obviously not this tall, but it's pretty tall. It reaches about that projector over there. And then you have all that, and then there's these reddish clumps of clay kind of surrounding it. It kind of appears like it's growing on it, and sometimes you can't really tell if the clay is growing and then moving upwards or downwards, but you can see that sometimes it droops as if it's being like stretched down. So when you look at it, you kind of feel like what is it? Like it's great, but it's vulnerable. Like you feel vulnerable. And then I'm trying to remember the 5 stages of discussing the art. Okay. Yeah. I'm trying to remember the title. So the next one, it's there we go. So that's the Transient Paradox by Raheleh Filsoofi, and it just looks like a bunch of clay pots of different colors just kind of sitting there, and then there's all these wires connecting down to it into an outlet. But what you can tell from the images is that each one of these pots, there's a different sound emanating from each one of them from different locations. So you'll either be hearing like natural sounds like water flowing or birds or wind, and sometimes there's human interruptions like voices or digging or cars passing by. Then we can go on to the next one. And this is the Village Potter by Roberto Lugo. Well, the Village Potter is more of the everything, right? It's a series of pots made by Roberto Lugo, which mix different art forms together. I believe it was Greek, Turkish, and Egyptian, and there's probably more in there. But using these classical styles in pottery, then they're decorated with graffiti-like art, and then on them you have important people, more specifically like Puerto Rican people or people who influence his work, or both. And these are very colorful. That's really it. So, what is it? The ones you see on the pictures that are laying down on the floor, they're usually about like this tall. And then the big one you saw at the beginning, I guess it reaches the pipes up there. Yeah. Yeah. You can go inside of it.
So that just brings you into our circling. Could you make those images fuller, Julio? Is that possible? Thank you. So we'll start by asking both of you a question on, so both of these artists that have, all of the artists involved, particularly Magdalene, Dykstra, and Raheleh Filsoofi, are talking about, in their work, are interested in seeing what it is like to be an artist in diaspora, what it's like to be away from one's land. Yeah. So I'm curious for both of you about thoughts, reflections on distance from land, what happens when one is different from one's homeland, right? The complications of homeland, right? And also, in some ways, the complications of returning. If the question of if returning is possible, or if it is more of a gesture. So questions about that, knowing that both of you were born elsewhere than where you live now, that both of you also, your mother tongue is a different tongue than what we are speaking in this conversation. So I'd love to hear some reflections about all of that.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Omar, and the question is a very, deep and layered and complicated one that I think I've spent the last 20, 30, 40 years of my life exploring. I was born in Saudi Arabia, the eastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and to a Syrian family with roots in Damascus and Hama, my mother and my father, respectively. Both with very different relationships to Syria. My mom, through Damascus, had a love and a longing for it always, and brought us back. The poetry, and the architecture, and the scents and the smells of life in Damascus were very sort of central to my Syrian identity and understanding. And my father, being from Hama, had a more complicated relationship. There was a very dark chapter of revolt that led to somewhere between 10 to 40,000 people being killed there about a month after I was born. And he was never comfortable going back, along with many of his family members. And so it was more of like something that he very willingly shut off from his life. And coming to Saudi Arabia to work was still a temporary thing in his mind, because we couldn't have become citizens there, and we couldn't have the kind of secure future that he was longing to have after his experience in Syria. So picked up and started over, I think, when I was about 4 years old, moved to the States. We first actually had settled just for a few months at my aunt's place in Queens. there's a beautiful chair that's going to appear up on the screen soon that used to belong to her and would later feature in one of my performances. But we ultimately ended up settling in the DC area, the capital of the United States, and a very cosmopolitan, I guess you could say, place, very transient place. People from embassies all over the world, and happened that the year that we had moved there, there was a school established that was meant to service the children of many of the embassy staff who had roots in the Arabic-speaking world. It was a Saudi Arabian sort of government initiative that was open to anybody who wanted to learn Arabic and ultimately also Islamic studies, and on a curriculum that was on par with what would have been taught back there. So it was a unique opportunity to have like this immersive Arabic program, cultural programming, Islamic sort of foundation in Washington, D.C. And with kids from all over the world, essentially, because the Muslim world is really the whole world. And so it was a very unique way to grow up. When I look at it in hindsight, it's something that I feel like was very formative for me in terms of shaping my identity, not just as a Syrian, but as somebody who's comfortable with different sorts of accents and dialects across the Arabic-speaking world, just from teachers and friends. Poetry was the backbone of is the backbone of the language, and it was taught to us weekly, so that became a big part of my life. And this was all happening in parallel to my, growing love for hip-hop culture. And so simultaneously, I'd be listening to rap music on my headphones, and I'd be kind of reviewing my poetry homework. And I remember trying to tell teachers in the school that these were poets that should be, studied and respected, just like the ones they were teaching us about and would get scoffed at. So maybe that sort of planted a seed in me to want to kind of prove them wrong. That said, I ended up going to the University of Virginia and studied architecture there. And that was also where I first started dabbling in music, performing, making beats, rapping, freestyling, getting on the local radio station and stuff like that. And the love for it just grew and grew. And it wasn't long after I graduated, maybe about 3 or 4 years, that I got first invitation to perform back in the Middle East, in Jordan, and this was probably like 2006. And it was just a very unique sort of representation of this music that was still not very prevalent at the time in the region. And now it's probably the largest sort of like musical genre in that part of the world, or at least has touched and influenced all aspects of popular music there. In fact, I just had the opportunity to perform at the World Cup, which is happening in Qatar. There's a few photos from here from that time, just this last week. Just got back last night, actually. And the finale on Sunday, the final match, is going to feature this Egyptian rapper, rising star, named Wegs, originally from Alexandria, who's become like an international sensation. Probably half my age, and it's really humbling and beautiful to see how this movement has grown so organically and taken on different elements of the local dialects and cultures and languages and trends just all across the region. Huge festivals are happening with artists from here now going and performing there, like Lupe Fiasco was just performing in Saudi Arabia last week, Busta Rhymes, DJ Khaled, and just all these things that, when I was growing up, I never in my wildest dreams thought I would see or experience in my lifetime. And it's been a really beautiful journey, and I owe so much of it to just understanding that art, when it comes from an honest place, a sincere place, when it represents your truth and your authentic self, can really resonate with people in ways that you'd never imagine. And so I feel very grateful that I've been able to do it for as long as I have, to keep evolving it in the way that I have, and to keep this connection to the culture and to the language and to the homeland in the way that I have. Though now, when it comes to Syria, I am not really allowed back. The political complications of me speaking out against the regime early on during the revolution there in 2011 made it such that not just me, but hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people can no longer return. There are Syrian refugees all over the world now, as you all know. Rappers all over the world speaking all kinds of languages and rapping in all kinds of languages. It's really phenomenal to see how, from all those different vantage points, people maintain this connection to the homeland and to the mother tongue in different ways. And how hip-hop, at its core, is this expression of, Black African-American life and reality and authenticity, and how through the struggles and the subsequent generations of expression, from Negro spirituals to blues to rock and roll to funk to disco to techno to hip-hop to trap, we owe all of that to the Black experience. And it's really at the foundation of all of these cultures' ability to tap into this authenticity. And that's something I feel, at least from my vantage point as an Arab American, is important to remind folks, because oftentimes there's this desire to claim it as their own without necessarily thinking about or acknowledging the roots of it, and I think that's important too. That said, I just wanted to touch on some of the photos that you're seeing are here. That's actually us just 2 nights ago performing in Qatar. There's a show that I've developed with these 2 gentlemen here called Little Syria, featuring Thanks Joey on the right. He's a beat maker of Syrian origin, born and raised in Brooklyn. Samples a lot of Arabic music, including his own grandfather's. He was one of the most prominent Arab American musicians, Syrian musicians in New York in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Performed all over the world, in fact. Played oud. Just like his brother on the right, Rani Mahdi, who is Palestinian, born and raised in Chicago, plays oud and piano in the show, and plays a whole bunch of other instruments as well. So representing New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, we came together to essentially tell the story of the first Syrian and Lebanese and Arab American immigrants who settled in the United States, Lower West Side of Manhattan, between the 1870s till about like the 1940s, when Wall Street interests took over that side of town. There's only about 3 buildings that remain from that time, like 2 tenement buildings and a church. The church is now a Chinese restaurant, I think. And the tenement buildings are, one of them is a restaurant, one of them is, I believe, a halfway house of some sort, something like that. But it's just really strange to stand there on Washington Street and imagine this thriving, bustling Arab community when you can literally look up and see the Freedom Tower and you're just surrounded by the financial district. There's a beautiful poetic irony to that I was drawn to kind of telling the story of. And so we do it through hip hop, through rapping, through poetry, through Arabic music, beat making, whistles. It's a unique sort of experience that I draw upon the traditions of the Hakawati, which is like the griot or the storyteller of Damascus, sitting in a chair, just like that, usually with a cane and a fez, telling stories in poetic, comparable form, sometimes in music, addressing the needs of the community, thinking about the history, thinking about the future, that sort of thing. So it's a modern interpretation of that, and something I'm really proud of, and it brought me to the World Cup last week, which was kind of cool. I think I remember my first time performing in Qatar was like back in 2009 or 10. They had just announced that they were going to have the host of the World Cup there. And I remember asking myself if I was even going to still be rapping at age 40. And here I am, doing my thing. We're all actually fathers and children. And, so we think about our work differently now. Think about passing these languages and traditions differently now. But it's a beautiful thing to be able to continue doing it this way.
There we go. How is the sound? Just checking in with everybody. You all can hear. 2 things. I want to return to that same question to Jose, but I'm also curious about, we, especially through your work, we've been looking at this real practices, the Hakawati, and thinking about how even storytelling can live within the visual art, can live within visual art. And kind of the storyteller as a living, breathing archive. Right? And particularly, we were talking about this just recently in terms of Filsoofi's work. And her practice of, which is the artist that had all of the different vessels, and with the wires, and as Jose beautifully described, with the sounds. And so in this way, as you encounter there, actually she's carrying where her body has been and where her collaborators' bodies have been. And this physical process of gathering clay, first kind of a really touching into the earth, right? And who is not the best storyteller than the earth itself, right? Even from the chemistry of the earth, right? The chemistry of in every level, organic or inorganic, as it were. Nevertheless, like this kind of spending time even going through the earth, Filsoofi talks about this process, even the physical labor of it, and gathering, and even seeing if there's enough clay within a soil to really be able to gel things together. You know, so thinking also about the Hekawati traversing, gathering stories. And we are also talking, and so thinking about the storytelling of the ceramicist who is working with earth itself. We also were talking about Magdalene Dykstra's work and how she is really interested in a lot of, it's so interesting because her examining two different points of tension, right? So the multiplicity of the species and also the individual, looking at the temporal and the permanent, exploring those tensions, and kind of what happens when the self is released in the service of the story, too. Thinking about the storyteller in that way, as moving archive, as someone whose responsibility is about continuation, and who also wrestles probably in real time with change. So how to navigate both of those kind of sentiments. There's nothing there, all over that. So those are just some things that we've been talking about. I know that Jose also has some thoughts on land, thoughts on translation, thoughts on mother tongue, and hand to him. And then I'd also just love to hear more, Omar, about this, even how does one come to embody in the practice, right, of the storyteller? And like as a contemporary person, right, who is navigating multiple worlds simultaneous, and what that might look like, you know, as one, and relationship to archive. So, first of all.
Okay. So it was mother tongue and then moving from. Yeah. So I'll talk about me moving over here. So I live most of my life. We're slowly approaching. I can't believe there's going to be a point where I live half my life here. But I live for as of now, I've lived most of my life in Puerto Rico. So moving over here was It was a big change. It was one I thought was that I would be fine with at first because I could stay in touch with people electronically and what have you. But then, I guess it never clicked with me how much things changed until both college and until COVID hit. Because for a while, it was easy to go back because I had family over there, so I had to go visit. But for a while, I started to not like going back because it felt like there was a responsibility placed on me to attend the needs of both of my family, both my father's and my mother's, and then also have to take care of the friends I still had over there, and it was a very, I guess, it was very stressful. And then like COVID hit, and then I wasn't able to go back and visit for, dang, two, I think almost 3 years. So going back again for the first time was very strange. It almost felt like alien. And that was not a feeling I was very fond of. But what is it? And then there's what is it? But then like going back, yeah, that's a question. Cause what is it? I did note, what is it? What is it? There's a couple of things I noticed. So over there, like what is it? I know over there, the authenticity of my nationality was never questioned, but was it moving over here, given that on my mother's side, we have a history of, I believe, on my great-grandmother's side, there's Austrian immigration, so we're paler than, most Hispanics. So coming over here, it's, sometimes people don't notice at first until like, I give them my name, and then it's like, oh wait. But what is it? It's not very pleasant to have that authenticity questioned either. And then like, I don't think I've been losing touch with Spanish, but like, what is it? I've noticed when it comes to, writing at the very least, there's more of a struggle there than speaking. Speaking, like, you only really need the same words over and over again, but then when you're writing, you're thinking about, how to do it formally, and then you start to realize, oh wait, there's pieces missing here. But yeah, I guess it's something, I've been either trying to learn how to get around or like, not get around, but I don't know. I guess either acclimate to it or just stop it, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, thank you for sharing that, Jose. I could definitely relate to quite a few of the things that you said. One part of my history that I left out was that I, upon graduating, moved to Los Angeles, and I spent 17 years in LA. I remember the moment where I realized, wow, I lived there longer than I lived anywhere else in my life, and how that was, exactly, it says Los Angeles on my shirt in Arabic. And I thought I'd never leave. In a weird way, after not being allowed to kind of go back and experience Syria anymore, I found myself sort of substituting a lot of the nostalgia I had for Syria with LA. They're very different cities, but physically, the topography is very similar, and the climate is very similar. And so it created this strange layer of memory. The dry heat, the mountains, the ocean, the pomegranates and tangerines, and the jasmine, and all of that. And just even in some level, the pace of life, the way the city was spread out, and even, I think, to a degree, just the majority of Chicano and Mexican culture as a foundation there, kind of that felt more familiar to me than the Northeast. Add to that also the huge populations of Asian immigrants from all over different parts of Asia, and Iranian, Korean, Chinese, just so diverse. I think I read one time it was like 65% of the population of Los Angeles speaks at least 2 languages, which is pretty unique, and it's also one of the most religiously diverse cities in the world. So yeah, it was very, very much an influence on me and how I started to see the world and shape my understanding of the world and what I could offer in terms of storytelling and harvesting the stories. I was reminded of, as you were talking about Filsoofi, that's just a really cool name. It means like philosopher, which is awesome. But there's a Iranian-American architect who passed away some time ago, Nader Khalili. And he had a foundation in the, about like 2 hours east of Los Angeles in like San Bernardino, where he built I guess he called it super adobe, but like these homes out of earth that were like domes stacked, really beautiful designs that were initially conceived of during his time in Iran to be earthquake-proof. And so they were literally fired like clay would be, and just beautiful domes. And he had an institution where people could come and learn this technique. It's still there, actually. It's called Cal Earth Arts. And since he passed, I think they went through like a bit of a difficult period staying open, but now there's been like a rejuvenation. And they're on Instagram now, so check them out and follow them. But I remember just being so drawn to him and his story and his spirit. I'm always quoting Rumi poetry. And he has a book that's kind of like a loose biography called Racing Alone that was just so beautiful to read. At the time that I read it, it was like the perfect time in my life. He called it Racing Alone because of like the story that he had mentioned early on in the book about watching his son at a playground trying to race with all these other kids in the playground, and he was smaller than the rest of them, and so he kept losing. And so he just went over to like another corner of the playground and started just kind of going in circles, and his dad asked him, like, what are you doing? He's like, you know, whenever I race with other people, I lose, but when I race alone, I always win, like I can never lose. And I get emotional just thinking about that now that I have a son who's, you know, has got a similar sort of like, just beautiful way of looking at the world. And that's kind of been something that stuck with me as far as the trajectory of my career, and not really comparing myself to anybody else's path, and knowing that how unique the stories that I've been able to kind of put into the world are, and celebrating that, and being a mirror for the culture and the community that I love and I celebrate in my work. So that was one thing that came to mind. And then another thing was how in the rubble of 9/11, so many documents, and in fact even the capstone to one of the Syrian churches were found in the rubble from this community that used to be there. And talk about just digging through, you know, and archiving. Had that not happened, those things might not have been found. It's fascinating that also the city for a long time resisted wanting to commemorate the neighborhood in any way because of the tension, the idea of this Arab community that they somehow tied to the tragedy of 9/11 being there, when in my mind it's like an opportunity. So that was kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to start telling the story in this way, and hope that as this project grows that we can get to a point where we can really talk about and celebrate this neighborhood the way that I think it deserves to be celebrated, because some really phenomenal writers and poets and people just live there, and amazing things happen there. They modified the Arabic printing press to be able to print in Arabic faster there, which changed the way that Arabic was disseminated in newspapers all over the world. Khalil Gibran, you know, and many other really amazing artists lived there. Amin Rayhani published the first Arab-American novel, 1914. It's Khalil Gibran went on to be the third highest selling poet in human history. He was actually between New York and then where he had lived more was another little Syrian neighborhood in Boston. And so they had these experiences all across the United States. There's that map also that you might see early on in the slideshow that talks about the journey of many people. Yeah, you can see kind of the entry point in New York for many. But it also should be stated that for a lot of people, like Southern California has one of the largest Syrian populations, and also Texas. And the majority of them had actually come up from Mexico, and like had been Latinized, if you will, spoke Spanish, and came to America from that experience. At one point, I think they said in like the 40s and 50s in El Paso, Texas, the word Syrian and grocer were synonymous. And in Southern California, you have some really interesting stories. There's a book by Sarah Gaultieri, Professor Sarah Gaultieri, called Arab Roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, where she talks about the Syrian Pacific, you know, as an idea. Touches on this nostalgia that I'm talking about, this misplaced nostalgia of the environment when you're there, being from the part of the world that we're from. But then also these stories, some really incredible ones. There was a lawyer who represented, I believe it was about like 40 Mexican-American youth who were charged with a murder. It was like the Sleepy Lagoon trial of the 40s, 17 Mexican youth in the 40s. And he ultimately was able to prove their innocence, and they were, you know, there was all kinds of racism and ethnocentric sort of like flexing by this state, I guess, and trying to charge these kids. And he felt sympathy for them, given his background. And funny enough, they actually had this, like, I think it was a play that turned into a movie in the 70s or 80s about this experience, and Edward James Olmos played him. But there was no mention of him being Arab, which is ironic. So yeah, I feel like there's so many of these stories and experiences that have just been kind of covered up conveniently and conveniently that I think it's important to start to re-examine and understand why. Some of it is our own fault, because as Jose was mentioning earlier, many Syrians can be very fair-skinned, so I can relate to that idea, and they really desired to be included in this category of white in America. And I think litigated successfully more than any other ethnic group to be considered white. Though that now has its complications politically for Arab Americans, because the majority of us don't really identify as that and don't get the privileges of that. And so it just becomes this convenient thing for another demographic, to include a few million people into their numbers. So yeah, there's a lot I could keep talking about why I think this stuff is important, but at the end of the day, for me, it's like I owe so much, again, to like hip-hop culture for just giving me a critical eye to understand this country from a different vantage point, and to speak to that experience through art and poetry and history and music in a way that I think is relevant to young people and can kind of just sandwich little kernels of knowledge in a cool musical experience. It's something I enjoy now a lot.
Thank you so much. Just you're speaking of critical eye, just thinking about the eye, and the eye, and the eye, exactly. Which also makes me think of something else that I'm going to hold in my mind to ask you both later. And so just noting that both Dykstra and Filsoofi, right, are talking also about eyes, right? And also here we are looking at visual artwork that requires a kind of engagement with this organ and our presence. And thinking about histories, also thinking about gaze, right? Which also I think is related to thinking about story. Whose story is told by whom, right? Who thinks that they have the right to tell what stories, all of these kind of complications around that. But also thinking about the realities of many in this diaspora, right? In the Swana diaspora, Arab diaspora, North African diaspora, etc., around surveillance and implications of what does it mean to be watched? What does it mean to be in a field where watching is required and then another kind of watching happens to you also? And some of these artists are also challenging, inviting a different type of watching and also speaking directly to this when Filsoofi is saying that her piece is called A Transient's Paradox, and it came out of a collection of nearly 2,000 sounds that she had collected post-Trump's election, and in the time of the travel ban. She is Iranian-American now, and the complications of this hybrid life. So the paradox being able to travel, but only to a certain extent, only within certain borders, only under the guide, with the permission of certain much more powerful bodies. So just thinking about surveillance, how surveillance shows up, knowing also, Omar, that you have spoken directly about these kind of experiences and phenomena, not just happening here, but also happening across the world, in lieu of, in walking with revolution in those different types of ways. So I'm just curious about surveillance, how surveillance what the implications of surveillance are, how that impacts one's art, how that impacts even self-censorship, the knowing and unknowing ways that surveillance impacts us of, ooh, these people might hear this, so for the safety of XYZ, I might have to, right? Or, ooh, I really need these people to hear this, so I'm going to say it in some other way, right? How we code ourselves. So I'm curious about that. I'm curious about ways, that has lived in your body, in your work, and also, any reflections on that topic.
So let's see. With regards to surveillance, I know. I think we discussed surveillance in my society, ethics, and technology class, and was it one thing I believe was discussed a lot was about the surveiller itself. So not only is the person or the entity surveilling you, keeping watch of you. Basically, you have to self-censor yourself around and all that. But they also control, what parts of their surveillance you have access to. So you're being, so at the end of the day, the entity that needs the most transparency is the one that has the least of it. And with regards to personal life, I know me and my friends have probably said a couple of jokes that probably put us on a list somewhere. So that's something that's something I'm aware of. Sometimes we even make jokes about it, saying replacing a word with putting something else in brackets, as if it was like censored. You know how what is it? Kind of like how was it not a Sharpie? Is it Sharpie? Would be used to like mark out a word or something like that. Yeah. Yeah. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you for speaking about that. It reminds me of something that happened to me, probably not. How old are you? If you don't mind me asking. 21, yeah, so I was about 23 when this happened. My friends and I were filming a music video on a rooftop. We had gotten permission from one of our friends. This was in Arlington, Virginia, so we could look at the DC skyline. We were all, one of us was Iraqi, one of us was Palestinian, I'm Syrian. The person filming it was Sudanese. And so again, we got permission. We asked the security guard, they said, yeah, no problem, we can go up to the rooftop. And we were filming, and then soon after we were done, we got a call from, well, actually the security guard downstairs said, okay, you have to go now. And we're like, all right. We left, and then it wasn't long after, later that day, we got calls from the FBI. And they were asking us, what we were filming, why. So interrogations and things like that. It was very traumatic. And I remember thinking to myself, like, oh man, like the security guard seems so nice. Like, why would he do that, And my friend who lived in the building ended up asking. Everything was fine. We told them we were just filming a music video, and ultimately they just wanted to see the footage, and then they saw the footage, and then they gave us a little more shit, but then ultimately we were okay, thankfully. But it only happened because we were from where we were from, and that was clear. And so he asked, my friend who lived in the building, asked the security guard, like, why would you call? He's like, I didn't call anybody. It was the young woman up there sunbathing while they were up there. And there was just one person up there who just felt uncomfortable, didn't like what she was seeing. Called the FBI on us. And how much that, could have changed the trajectory of our life completely, had it gone any worse, or had we had temper, or had we not answered questions the right way. So that came to mind. But then also just the idea of, like you were saying, eyes and what they mean. They're so central to our culture in so many different ways. There's a music video / eulogy. There's an image that comes up here called Close My Eyes. That's a eulogy to my father, who had passed when I was real young, but I didn't end up really writing much about it until later. It took me a long time to really process it. I still am. So this was like an homage to him and his life. It's called Close My Eyes, and it features a little sample from like it's often done in hip-hop music, like another song where the singer's saying, I close my eyes and I see you now. And, thinking about the day that he had passed and seeing, people physically close his eyes, thinking about, what that means for us, generation after generation, and memories, and what we put into our eyes and ultimately into our minds and our subconscious, and if those things get passed down generation after generation, and how much more intensified that experience is now through social media, this digital programming. But if you get an opportunity to watch the video, it just kind of shows images of him in his youth, because during the process of making the video, I ended up stumbling upon a little treasure trove of photos of his time in college. Black and white images of him. He was the first person in his city to be able to leave and study abroad. He had really high marks in school, and so it got him a scholarship to study in Egypt. So it's photos of him and his friends in Cairo. And it's a part of his life that I'd never really known much about. Even my mom didn't know much about. And so it was really fascinating to kind of have that opportunity to kind of dig into that. And lo and behold, soon after we had released it, which was, as you can see, just we're coming on a 4-year anniversary now. That's my birthday is December 18th. That day that we were releasing the video, my then 2-week-old daughter was admitted into the ICU for breathing complications, and ended up spending a month there in chest tubes. And didn't know if we were going to, excuse me, if she was going to make it through. Really just a profound sort of experience, and for all that to happen at the time that this was being released was really profound for me and our family. And a few months later, as the video started to circulate online, I got a message from somebody on social media who said, "That's my grandfather hanging out with your dad in that picture." And apparently they'd gone to college together, and he was a fan of mine, and here we are 50 years later, making this connection through this one picture that somebody had taken on a rooftop in Cairo. And they both passed. So yeah, there's just so much you could say about that experience and these lives that we lead. And you never know when people will be brought into your path and when and why and how. It's all meant to be, I guess the last thing I'll say is that I was, again, in Qatar these last few weeks during the World Cup, and just noticing how, this really monumental event, people from all over the world were gathering to experience. And there were so many moments where everybody had their phones up and were literally actually in the stadium looking at their phone. Because there's this augmented reality app where you can actually see. If you hold it up, you can see who the player is and it puts their number and their statistics and stuff like that. And it's why don't you just watch it at home then? It's you might as well just play a video game. That's what you're going to do here. But yeah, I don't really have much to say beyond that, but it was just wow, what a time to be alive, and I'm still processing those moments,
Yeah, deeply appreciating that point, and Jose and Leanne and I have spoken about things like, just because we can, does that mean we should? Right? Those kind of questions. And just noticing in this beautiful picture and thinking about Roberto Lugo's work and his practices of, that idea of belonging to community, of being the village potter, right? Of being in community practice. And questions around who does this work belong to, right? And that it becomes a collective type of belonging. So this particular piece of Lugo, you can go inside. He actually, interestingly, as you speak, Omar, about this, the way that the intermediary of the technology, but actually Lugo intentionally has this space so people can go into it and take a selfie in it, right? So that there's this kind of acknowledgement, okay, yeah, you want to take a selfie, here we go, in this. One question, and so then you enter a kind of room, a different kind of space, an altered space, really. Being surrounded by the artist's work, the artist's voice, being surrounded also by graffiti held in the same esteem as ornamental, classical, ornamental, Eurocentric kind of ceramic practices, decorative practices. And I'm thinking also about the ways that pottery, ceramics as artifacts show up in different places, how they are archaeolized, kind of thing, or they're I almost said anthropomorphized, which would be amazing to have anthropomorphic pottery, but that's my imagination.
There's a AI app for that.
Oh yeah, there's but also just thinking about we're talking about surveillance, talking about even what is uncovered in 9/11, talking about what is appropriated or commandeered, right? When you're talking about hip hop not being acknowledged, or different, the Black experience not being acknowledged, and as people kind of absorb it into their own, the results of into their own, and thinking also about the looting, right? Looting of significant cultural objects that happen again and again. And the way that these contemporary artists are pushing against that, right, with more agency. But you've spoken, Omar, about these kind of reconstructed rooms, Syrian rooms, and how they even had your own kind of physical experience entering one, and kind of the specters that inhabit those spaces, and the question of to whom do they belong actually, and who should have access, and all of that. So knowing that that's been part of your research into Little Syria, knowing that that's also part of the sorrow song of not being able to return to Syria, knowing the complications of the kind of different tributaries of your parents' stories in relationship to home, to homeland, to belonging, and to the, all of that complication. And just wondering if you could share a little bit about your reflections on what is that kind of experience, and a bit about those rooms.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. So in that Close My Eyes image, and in then another image that might be circulating, I'm in what often is described as a Damascus room, and it's like a growing trend with museums now to acquire these sorts of rooms. They're kind of taken apart from the old city of Damascus. This wooden paneling. It has what's called Ajami style polychrome painting, and a couple hundred years old, three sometimes 100 years old, and poetic inscriptions on the walls, and they represent the living rooms and the living spaces of families from Damascus. Sometimes, actually, if you keep scrolling, Leo, there's one more that we just filmed something in Qatar. They had ended up acquiring one of these rooms. I've gotten to know, yes, exactly, one of the architectural preservationists who does a lot of the restorations. He spent many years in Damascus. Does it from a really genuine place, but also herself acknowledges how this is a tricky business, and business is definitely what it is. And one has to wonder why there's more desire to acquire these rooms than there is to help people themselves find homes abroad. I also just hate seeing these rooms in museums and have a velvet rope in front of them for people to just stare at them, and them no longer be living, breathing experiences. So through my network, I've started to kind of make it a mission of mine to kind of activate these spaces through music and poetry, get special permission to perform in them. It's still complicated, and I acknowledge that, but I feel like at least better than nothing. And I get emotional when I'm in these rooms. So we were recording song, a little music video performance in this space, I was just thinking how, this is wood paneling harvested from the Ghouta, which is like the valley around Damascus, from the trees around there that I share 50% of my DNA with. How, the work of these artisans and craftsmen took generations to kind of cultivate. The poetry on the walls talks about the pride of the families being able to kind of share this space with their guests. And the irony of that, now that it's just kind of spirited away in the middle of the night, in the middle of a war, and deconstructed and then put back together somewhere else for people to stare at, is not lost on me, but is something that I think, again, like you said, for someone like me who is essentially in exile, like it's the only chance I get to kind of touch that experience in such a, tactile way. And it's something, again, I acknowledge is like complicated, but I feel I owe it to these spaces, I owe it to the craftsmen, I owe it to the families to be able to at least reflect some sense of life and art and poetics, into an otherwise just empty room. So yeah, that's kind of part of that. The Met in New York has one, big, beautiful one. Yeah, and I'm hoping that by having done this that I can start to convince them to maybe open that up to me, but that's a much harder place to crack. But we'll see. We'll see. So the other one that was in the Close My Eyes videos from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And that one was really unique for me because I hadn't seen one that wasn't covered in like this dark varnish. So it was like much more raw and beautiful. I remember when I'd first gotten permission to go inside because they were asking, basically the way the relationship started was they just wanted someone to help them translate the poetry on the walls. And so it was just this like nondescript warehouse that the LACMA owned on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles, like next to Staples or something. And so like, I remember walking in and there was like a big space like this, and there was like a big black box, kind of like a Kaaba, just black drapes around it, and then a little doorway, and I just walked inside and just explosion of color. And it just moved me to tears, like I couldn't believe it, I was, again, like asked to help the poetry and to recite some of it, and then it became like a longer relationship with them, and from that I was able to parlay meeting this preservationist and getting to know more of her work, and then getting ultimately into the space when I was in Qatar last week. And this one is stunning, but they're always different than you would see them in the real original context. Like the ceilings are usually a lot higher up. That's usually white plaster, not gray. With the way that those corners are sticking out wouldn't be that way. There's nothing perfect about handmade, crafts like this. And so to put it into a perfectly square box, it's not going to work. So you end up having these strange moments where like the stuff sticks out of the sides. But when you're in it and you're in Damascus itself, everything is like that, The alleys are all a little crooked and the balconies are all a little off, but it's like all just, the way that it's been and slowly plastered over and redone and remade over time, and that's just how it is. So when it's taken out of that context, it reveals what some people see as like imperfections, but to me it's just like a reminder that you can't take it out of its original context without sacrificing something. That's pretty important. Yeah.
So, okay. It's like on, off. Okay, good. You haven't talked about your peace activism yet. So I hoped that you could do that by sharing a little bit of rhyme. And this is a request, which you would have to deny in front of a lot of people. No pressure. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
No then, Jose, if you could link that to one of the works, whether it's something that comes up, a thematic that comes up in what Omar shares, or just the concept of peace activism, which I see as it's love. There's all kinds of love bound up in that. You've written some very interesting things about love. Yes.
Thank you. That's important because I can talk and people start to doze off because I'm a pretty mellow guy. So let me wake you up a little bit. Thinking of a master plan, cause there ain't nothing but the sweat on my mama's brow ever since we left Damascus with nowhere to settle down. Running like the river, couple babies in the basket, we get around. Tupac Shakur, who's got the cure to stop the furor of cops and war over hollow ground? When hearts were pure, the bombs were not. Who's got some more to drop and harm the flock? Menorah you talk, shit. Holes that we're coming from? And why you digging in the dirt that we running from? Black gold in the desert got them plundering. This ain't a jungle, but sometimes I'm left wondering how many more gotta die before you listen. Running out of breath trying to catch your attention. Now ain't the time to go half on this mission. Give me liberty or death from your open air prison where it's too hot to fit in, no pot to piss in. Refugees, please, hands, knees, submitting to the Most High. Crossing the seas, knowing most die. Praying that dry land close by. Why try? Unless we thought that it was safer than the places we escaped from. Head heavy like a bass drum. Going wherever wind makes us. Chasing the papers that you take from. Granted, like your kitchen counter and all the meals that you waste on it. Only wish that we could taste some. Must be nice, trust me, ice. Give us the chills when we face them. They kick us out and get a pay stub. Pyramid schemes of a mason. By the time the right folks finally ask, should I say something? The wrong ones done erased us. Cause chosen ones never chose this. Tiptoeing on the precipice of indefinite exodus. The pharaohs want us hopeless, only concerned in his own bliss. Chauvinist on that presidential pulpit. New story with an old twist. Too gory for these poor kids. Lord, please help us focus. Send us another brother Moses to replace him. Send us another brother Moses to replace him.
Sorry. I guess what is it? This goes back. This goes back to surveillance again, but less so in the case of what is it? Surveilling to prevent the danger, more so surveilling to, I guess, censor. So there's I know when we were talking about surveillance in the SET class, we were also mentioning, the usage of drones, and one thing that was brought up was how on very frequent occasions, politicians would lie about what's going on with the drones, saying, we only hit, the supposed terrorists, and so we're doing a good job. And that really wasn't what was going on. Because then, you had whistleblowers leaking information, but there's one transcript there was a reading of, not in class, but there's a video of it being read, and it showed a very different picture from what was being said at the time. So, I don't know, there appears to be this need to surveil, but really that's not really the case, yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of the complicated nature of the Barack Obama presidency. For many people, for me included, like, it was a very powerful moment to see an African-American man, reach the highest levels of office here, and super charismatic and likable person on so many levels. But then at the same time, he was responsible for more drone attacks than anybody before him, and the way that he handled the Syrian conflict, mishandled the Syrian conflict, was also really kind of difficult to swallow. And then ultimately the sort of like way that he writes about it now, in this sort of matter of fact, kind of reputation, washing, of the situation to make himself sleep better at night, I guess, is something that's really difficult to kind of have to see. And again, I think he's a very likable person. I'd love to sit and talk to him sometime. But it's just like this, again, reflection of this crazy world that we're in, where you can totally isolate yourself and insulate yourself from the harm that you can cause, thousands of miles away with the click of a button. And that's just getting more and more real, scary. And we're so connected now that you can't escape it. So the only solution is to kind of cover it up, and there's really powerful ways to redact and cover up the reality and the truth that you're living in now. And people can just choose to live in the version of truth that they want, and we see that happening in this country now in very scary ways. But to kind of take it to a different side of it, we were talking about redaction, I think, during one of our phone calls, and it had just so happened that, I was in Qatar with my 2 colleagues, and one of them who makes beats, Joey, was telling me about this new AI program that's free online called La. It's like .ai, where you can basically put a song in, and it can remove elements of the song. So if you just want the drums of this classic Beatles song, you could just plug it in, and in a few seconds or minutes, it'll give you just the drums. If you just want to remove the voice and just hear the instrumental, you can do that. Essentially giving you what we call the stems of the session, as if you were there at the original recording session. That's, mind-blowing for a music maker to be able to kind of do that now, and to think about the ways that can be applied to all kinds of things, historical images where somebody might be uncomfortable, like Jerry Jones seeing himself in a picture, could probably very easily just remove himself from a picture and be like, I was in there, this is the real one, or something. Or whatever, just all kinds of things. And how I think because of the nature of the technology now, diminishing our attention spans to a degree that we can barely keep up anymore with what's happening now, let alone what happened a month ago, and how that ripple effect is going to be on generation after generation, and how easy it is going to be to cover up crimes, cover up war crimes. And all of that ultimately just leads me back to this feeling that what I've always loved about what I get to do is being in community with people. And I was really kind of nervous during the pandemic, especially in the early days, where it's oh man, is this it now? I'm just going to be zooming my way through my career? This is horrible, I was lucky that I could do it, but still, it just didn't feel right. It was kind of chipping away at me. And I remember when we were able to perform Little Syria, bring it back, basically, after this 2-year hiatus. We sold out the Brooklyn Academy of Music 3 nights in a row. And it was just this super gratifying and, just necessary thing to give me life again and to remind me this is what matters more. These real human connections and these experiences, looking at people in the eye and being able to actually carry those feelings in your heart and in your mind, and not just the sort of filtered version of that. It was also the first time I sat in a room and I looked up at an entire room of people in masks, and I was doing the call and response that I would normally do in a show, and I didn't know if people were responding or not, which was kind of strange. But I also realized I prefer, I don't know if it's a result of the pandemic or just me getting older or just who I am, but I prefer smaller settings. So that space that we were in was 300 people, which was perfect for me. When we were at the World Cup, not that I didn't enjoy it, but it's just the intensity of 5, 6, 10,000 people. You don't get to have that same sort of connection. Of course, everybody's there with their phones up, and it's just not really the same experience. So I'm just glad that I can speak that out loud now and to that and not feel like I'm missing anything.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. I think one thing that it makes me think of, and connecting also to Leanne's question and to Jose's reflection about that which is named lives, right? And which is also, shout out to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, right? The book of coming forth into the day. And so, and the complications of that, right? Again, this complication of who is doing the naming, right? What is being named even falsely, right? So that a drone use can be named peace, right? A peace action, right? And right, exactly, it's the flipped world, right? It's the inversion of everything. And thinking also about the artworks that we've spent time with, that Magdalene Dykstra's work, Babel, right? And the consideration, of course, of that story, right? In the biblical sense, but also in all of the senses of it, of misunderstanding, and also the ways that there's a kind of consideration of accumulation, and how amongst all the Babel, what becomes, what can no longer be heard, what names no longer, like, can we discern, right? What volume becomes louder and overwhelms the truth. And so thinking about how we name ourselves, thinking also about the Hakuati, about the poet, about the lyricist, about the rapper, whose work is to name continuously, right? As an act of remembering, of bringing together, of revisioning, right? As an act of, like, kind of a tribute to the past, in the present that also moves us towards the future. So thinking about all of that, and also thinking about how naming together creates a different type of alchemy. And knowing collaboration is very important in your work. Knowing also the ways that the artists that we've been working with have been collaborating with materials, have been collaborating with colleagues, have been collaborating with ideas also, collaborating with sound, collaborating with environment, collaborating with community. And I know also that Jose also felt particularly drawn. You have a song, Damascus, which is very collaborative in nature. And I know Jose had some questions about that or curiosities about that work and ways that it felt very activating for him, that he shared. It would be beautiful to hear from him.
So, what is it?
And you all have this also with you.
I know you had mentioned that this was mostly due to, was it your friend who had helped mix the song, but I figured it'd be helpful for the crowd to mention why you had decided to sample the song El Ciego for Damascus, because one of the reasons it stood out to me was because there was Spanish involved in the song. So
Yeah, you want to read the lines in Spanish? Maybe tell them what it means.
Es la cosa más triste de este mundo, y así me siento yo por ti, solo por ti. Oh, the last part? Oh, or just the whole. So it's it's the saddest thing in the world, and that's how I feel for you, only for you.
So this is a, thank you, Jose. This is a song called Damascus, and it's actually off my first solo album. And it's a translation of a poem by Nizar Qabbani, who was one of the most prominent poets from the Arabic-speaking world in the 20th century. Many of his poems were sung by some of the most famous singers. But this particular poem is very, very, very much just about life in Damascus. And so, his other pieces can be about love or about politics. And they resonate all across the Arab world. But this one is really like for the people of Damascus. And you see it written, lines of it written in cafes all around town. He talks about life in the old city. his family, his memories. It was written while he was in the Foreign Service for a while, and then he was also kind of like on a persona non grata for a while because of some of the political poetry he had written. So he was away, and he wrote it when he was not in Damascus. And looking back on it and longing for it. And my mother had kind of told me about this poem when I was younger, and I remember memorizing it and it just being a big part of our life. And my friend who made the beat for this particular song had sampled this piece by Armando Manzanero called El Ciego. And he's singing about all these beautiful things in the world that, you know, a blind man doesn't get to see, and that's how he feels about not being able to be with his love. And it seemed very fitting in terms of how I related to Damascus, how Nizat Rabbani related to Damascus, to be able to kind of work those lyrics into the song this way. I've always loved also just the blending of Spanish and Arabic music. They really kind of have a seamless disconnection. And you can hear that in so many different examples, from Andalusian music, from the Middle Ages, to some of the most popular songs like Habibi Anulayn by Amr Diab, which is like the first major like world sensation from Egypt in the 90s. And yeah, there's even an album I remember loving so much when I was younger. Came out in the 90s called Hanin Isom Cubano, which is like a Lebanese singer, Hanin, a Lebanese Cuban composer, and then a Cuban band taking classical Arabic music, using a Cuban band and Cuban instrumentation to sing these classical Arabic songs. And I just remember, like, from top to bottom, I used to listen to that album so much. And it was, like I said, seamless, like the way that you could transition from one kind of to the other. So yeah, this song kind of is just an homage to that. Being in Los Angeles at the time, I felt again this sort of like unspoken connection to this other culture, this like different way of understanding America, this different way of understanding history. And I remember there was a really powerful moment way after I had written this song, but I think it was like during the election of Trump, like during the election cycle, and Syrian refugees were just being kind of used as pawns, and we don't want them here, and if I'm elected, I'm going to kick them all out, and blah blah blah. And I remember at that time reading something really interesting, which was that the city of Los Angeles, which if you close your eyes, probably one of the first things you think about, palm trees, but they're actually not indigenous to the Southwest. There's only one kind that is. It's called the Washingtonia, which I'm sure the indigenous did not call it that. But every other kind of palm tree that you see in Los Angeles was effectively brought by the Spaniards when they were colonizing, through the Spanish missions, to be reminded of the Iberian Peninsula. However, they're not even really indigenous to the Iberian Peninsula. It was the Arabs who had come from Syria and from Iraq, who wanted, and of course Morocco, who wanted to be reminded of where they came from. And so these palm trees were planted there. There's poetry written to that effect that talks about even how, like I remember, Abdurrahman Dakhil has this poem, Al-Rusafa, where he's talking about this palm tree in his courtyard, looking at it and saying, you, like me, are not from here, but you're planted firmly, and you beautify this place, but you carry the memories of another place, something to that effect. And I just remember feeling like this really, this deep sadness, because we had just had my baby boy, who was like twice removed from Syria, you could say. And all the stuff that was being said, in the war at the time, it was just, anytime you put the word Syria in Google, it was just death, and that wasn't how I grew up. I had all kinds of other connotations with the first churches and the first mosques and all this poetry and this beautiful stuff, history. But now it's just this like weight. And so I read this thing about the palm trees, and I was like, how about that? And I remember stepping outside, holding my son, baby at the time, and we had a palm tree right in front of our house, and I just felt like, you're just like this tree, and you're firmly rooted, and you are making this experience beautiful for people, and that's what matters, So, yeah, that's I think another way of understanding, our relationships to cities, our relationships to the natural world. And in the Close My Eyes video, other than the scenes in that Damascus room, we actually shot scenes on a friend of mine's date palm farm in the Coachella Valley, where you truly feel like you're in the Arabian desert, and he himself was like a second generation Egyptian-American date palm farm grower. And yeah, it was just like a really beautiful experience to be able to kind of have that all kind of symbolically present in the song, and the generational sort of connections between my father and his journey to America, and then my journey from the East to the West Coast, and then my son being born. And here we are now, we're back on the East Coast, and we might end up back there, who knows?
So we just have a few minutes left and want to make space if any questions, curiosities, thoughts are coming forward for anybody in attendance. I'm looking at you, my child, not to look at it, but I'm pretending about it. Okay. A couple of things. One is that each of you hopefully have noticed, in addition to this, you've noticed that you have a copy of The Prophet, which, if you have not read, is such an extraordinary book. So please pick that up and read it again and again and again. That's one. Two is just to say, to open and say, there are other things that feel like they should come forward, questions that we have for one another, curiosities, etc. Or thoughts that you feel like, ooh, yeah, something that wanted to come forward.
Actually, if you don't mind going back to that, the image of the chair, but it's fine, we don't have to go back. That's just a photo of my aunt's chair. My aunt was the one, if you recall in the beginning, when I mentioned when I first moved to America. I was living in Queens at the time, and she ultimately ended up moving back to Lebanon. And this chair stayed here in New York. And when I moved back here last year, after those 17 years in LA, quote unquote, inherited this chair. She has passed away, she transitioned in 2016. It was in disarray and needed to be reupholstered, needed to be, just shown some love. And so I started to look for craftsmen in the area who might be able to help me kind of, just fix it up, because I wanted to use it in the Little Syria show, and just commemorate her in that way. And I was very fortunate enough to find an Italian furniture, like antique furniture restoration specialist who had done some work on Syrian furniture and was very, very helpful. And we had this really great kind of connection, and the fabric is actually this like Mexican fabric, and it just works perfectly, and I think that just, again, is another sort of example of that beautiful connection there between the cultures. And so there she is, like holding me up in New York all these years later. And I remember just like her very magnanimous way of embracing me, so like loving and sweet. Just wanted to kind of mention that. Also, my son's name is Gibran. We had named him, to honor the poet whose book you have there, The Prophet. But the way that we had landed on his name was really beautiful. My wife's family is African American, and Jewish American. And in the Jewish, like Ashkenazi tradition, when you name after somebody, you don't use the actual name, you use the first letter. Often, that's what's done. And so, to honor her black grandfather, James, her sisters had all kinds of J names in the family. So Jace, Jabin, Jacob, Jamie. So we wanted a J name, and I wanted an Arabic name that had sort of, connection to my work and my history, and we landed on Gibran. Ironically, his name ended up getting spelled with a G at Ellis Island. So that's how people know him. That's how it's probably written in the book. It's Khalil Gibran with a G. But the sound letter G is actually more akin to the J. So us spelling it with a J was kind of a nice little way of honoring his great-grandfather and his grandfather. And then, of course, he was born in Los Angeles, so the majority of people there would actually pronounce it Hebron, which I wasn't expecting. That was pretty cool. And Hebron is actually a city in Palestine that in Arabic is called Khalid, which is really interesting. I just thought of that. And then there's one sketch that kind of came up. It was like a figure, somewhat androgynous figure, holding like a flag. And this is just the last thing I'll say. This is a sketch by Khalil Gibran. He was a poet, but he was also a painter and a writer, and like a visual artist, painter, and illustrator. Beautiful paintings, and yeah, exactly. And so this actually at the bottom says, Surya al-Hurra, which means like free Syria, Birishit Gibran, so with the pen and the reed of Gibran. And then in the flag it says, Ala anqad madina, nabni majd atina. So upon the rubble of our past, we will build our future glory. And you can see kind of a little bit of America in it, a little bit of the Statue of Liberty, a little bit of ancient Greek, a little bit of Arab, a little bit of Jesus, a little bit of Sufi, a little bit of everything in there. Yeah, it's just, I think it was really special for me to kind of find that image in the archives and think about how there's this idea of a free Syria that we've been chasing for so long. Over 100 years, in fact.
Can you say that again? From the rubble? Can you translate
Ala
that?
anqad madina, so upon the rubble of our past, nabni majd atina, we build glory that's coming, like a future glory. So very fitting, I think, for the topic of excavation, finding meaning. Now he's identified as Lebanese American because that's in fact where he was from, and the whole Syria-Lebanon thing is there's a whole other conversation there. But in his work and at the time, the region was identified as Syria, Greater Syria, which included Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria. So it was, I think, a reflection of that idea and a hope for, and as you read the prophet, you see echoes of his just like understanding of philosophies, understanding of Sufi traditions, of Christian traditions of different backgrounds. He himself is from a Maronite family, Maronite Christian family, and just sort of trying to siphon all of the most beautiful lessons that he could from life and from these various traditions and turn them into like a fictitious but still very real sort of like a book of parable. I think, again, what many say is the reason why he's the third highest selling poet in human history. This book, I think, was translated into dozens of languages. He wrote initially only in Arabic and then began to write in English later in life. And made his way back to Arabic eventually as well. So.
just also just acknowledging again this idea, the work of all the artists present, including around the building upon, and just how beautiful to end in this way with towards the future, and also upon just to acknowledge all the folks that we who hold us, who have brought us to where we are. Those that we know and whose names we know and can speak, those whose names have been seemingly forgotten, who have been, that need to be uncovered. Right? And just expressing deep appreciation for all those folks. Expressing also appreciation for José's mama, who is here, who brings him here. Expressing appreciation for all of our parents, all of us, all of our people who bring us here. And that with that beautiful aspiration for our moving towards our freedom, right? And moving towards real peace, right? And how peace is walked so close with love. And that how that brings us towards a future that actually can exist, right? Instead of one that is unstable and rubble, and a place where there can be home for everyone. That we can see our connections to one another in real time and in real action. And where the rooms can open and the people are cared for as much as the objects. Thank you all for being here. It has been a gift to walk with José during this month. I'm so glad to bring you into our gathering, Omar. And always a gift to co-learn with my colleague, Dr. Leon Francis. Thank you, Julio. Thank you, dear friend, for videotaping us. And just really expressing so much gratitude, hoping that you all will be able to spend time with the artworks in the museum, in the Domestic Arts Building. I think they're still open now. Sam, is that true? The museum is open. Is the DAB? It's not. Okay, if anybody wants to head there. Also just noting that we have weathered a storm together. So I feel like that bonds us in a deeper way. It has been raining. It has been, beautifully. The ground is, the plants will be happy. Thank you all again for your company, and I'm hoping we meet many, many times in the future. Thank you so much. Please, get some dates, get some snacks.